There comes a moment in life when silence grows between parent and child, and the ache isn't in being forgotten, but in being unseen. If you've ever felt it, that slow shift where the light in their eyes dims when they look at you, know this. You are not alone, and you are not broken. Respect is not something you have lost. It's something that can be welcomed back, not by louder words, but by quieter strength. Today, let's walk together through 6 gentle shifts that help respect find its way home again. Not by chasing it, but by standing still long enough for it to recognize you once more. 1. Reclaiming the self. Letting go of approval. Seeking. There is a hunger that grows in silence, the hunger to be seen, to be valued, to matter still. And sometimes, without realizing, we begin to trade pieces of ourselves for glances of recognition. Margaret knew this hunger. She bent herself into smaller shapes, softer words, easier silences, hoping her children would notice her effort, reward her with attention. She became agreeable, predictable, always available, always saying yes. And in that endless bending, something precious slipped away, herself. Not because they asked it of her, but because somewhere along the way, she thought love meant disappearing quietly into their needs. It wasn't until an old friend said, with a sadness Margaret hadn't seen in herself, "You used to laugh louder than this. You used to shine brighter." Something inside her stirred. Margaret picked up her old hobbies again, reading novels that weren't on anyone's recommendation list, wearing colors that felt like a return, saying no to gatherings that drained her spirit. And something shifted. Her children, who had once looked past her, began to look at her again, not because she demanded it, but because she carried herself with a quiet light they could not help but notice. Science might say, self-abandonment erodes identity, and without identity, relational respect wanes. But the truth is simpler and deeper. Respect does not grow where the self has been emptied. It returns when you live again from the roots of your own becoming. You do not need to shrink to be loved. You do not need to agree to be worthy. You need only to return to yourself, and let love and respect meet you there. 2. Steady presence over sharp words. There is a strength that doesn't raise its voice, doesn't pound its fist, doesn't demand a stage. It stands like a mountain at dawn, silent, immovable, etched not by storms, but by the patient winds of time. Frank had once believed that the louder he spoke, the more he would be heard, that if he could just find the right words, the sharpest argument, the undeniable point, respect would come. But arguments, he learned, build walls faster than they build bridges. Each raised voice, each frustrated conversation, only deepened the distance. It wasn't until he grew tired of fighting, not tired from weakness, but tired of the emptiness it left behind, that he changed. He stopped rushing to respond. He stopped sharpening his words like weapons. Instead, he became a steady flame, present, calm, unshaken by every gust of disagreement. At family gatherings, he would listen longer than he spoke. He would nod without rushing to correct. He would say what needed to be said, softly once, and then let silence carry the weight of his certainty. And slowly, without announcement, things shifted. His children leaned in differently. Not to argue, but to listen. Science might frame it in terms of emotional regulation and relational dynamics, but the truth feels simpler. Presence outlasts noise. Dignity speaks louder than volume. You do not earn respect by overpowering. You invite it by standing quietly, faithfully, in the fullness of who you are, without needing to shout to be seen. 3. Wholeness without dependence. There is a tenderness in reaching for someone, but when reaching becomes clinging, even love can feel heavy. Helen had always been the heart of her family. She poured her days into their needs, her evenings into their calls, her hopes into their visits. But over time, she noticed the spaces between conversations growing wider, the silences stretching longer. At first, she thought it was them, their busy lives, their distracted hearts. But somewhere beneath her sadness, a quieter truth stirred. Love breathes easier when it is not carrying the weight of another's wholeness. Helen realized her life had become a waiting room, always paused, always looking toward the next moment of their attention to feel alive again. So she began quietly to return to herself. Morning walks alone, where the sun greeted her without needing permission. Afternoons spent with new friends, where laughter did not have to be earned. Evenings curled into books that spoke to parts of her she had almost forgotten. And slowly, something shifted. She wasn't less loved, she was simply less dependent. And in that space, her children found her again. Not as someone waiting at the window, but as someone shining through it. Science might call it emotional differentiation. Healing calls it returning home. Respect does not grow when others are asked to complete us. It grows when they are invited to stand beside someone already whole. You are not waiting for anyone to fill you. You are already a garden, already a river, already enough. And when you live from that fullness, the ones you love find you not out of obligation, but out of awe. 4. The quiet power of boundaries. There is a kind of love that forgets to protect itself. It stretches and bends, saying yes again and again, until it loses the shape of dignity and becomes something smaller. Robert knew this kind of love well. He wore it like an old coat, comforting, familiar, but fraying at the edges. In conversations with his children, he would smile through interruptions, laugh off dismissals, let his voice trail off mid-thought, because somewhere deep inside, he believed that love meant making himself small so they could grow tall. But something inside him began to ache, not from anger, not from pride, but from a quiet longing to be seen whole again. One afternoon, over coffee and clinking cups, Robert felt that ache rise higher than his fear. He looked across the table at his son, whose voice had once again risen over his own, and he said, softly without anger, "Please, let me finish." And the room shifted, not dramatically, not immediately, but something unseen realigned itself. His son paused, listened, and in that pause, respect returned like a slow tide. Robert had not raised his voice. He had not built a wall. He had simply drawn a line that said, "Here I am, whole, worthy of finishing my own sentence." Science might call it boundary assertion, but the soul knows it simply as self-respect spoken in a whisper. Boundaries aren't punishments. They are invitations to meet each other where love and dignity still stand side by side. You don't have to roar to be heard. You only have to stay standing in the space your soul still remembers you deserve. 5. Giving with balance, not burnout. There is a beauty in giving, a glow that warms both the hand that offers and the one that receives. But even a flame, left unchecked, can burn itself down to nothing. George had always been generous, the first to volunteer, the first to lend a hand, the first to say, "It's no trouble at all." At first his children marveled at his kindness. They leaned into his open hands, grateful, admiring. But over time, the gratitude softened. The asking grew. The expectation settled in, quiet but steady. And somewhere along the way, George realized that the people he loved most had stopped seeing him. Not out of cruelty, but because his constant giving had made him invisible. He had given everything, time, money, effort, energy, until there was nothing left to light the spaces he once filled with laughter and presence. One evening, after a long day spent running errands he hadn't wanted to run, George sat alone in his quiet living room and whispered to himself, "I miss me." And so he began again, this time carefully. He began saying no when his spirit needed rest. He offered help only when his heart could offer it freely, not from obligation. And something surprising happened. His children looked at him differently, not as a convenience, not as an endless well, but as a person, with boundaries, with edges, with a light that was precious again. Science might explain this as boundary assertion, restoring relational balance, but the soul knows better. When giving becomes expected, it loses its holiness. But when it is chosen, it becomes sacred again. You are not here to pour yourself into. You are here to shine, and to choose, with love, how your light is shared. 6. Becoming bigger than their orbit. There is a difference between being needed and being seen. For years, Eleanor measured her days by her children's schedules, their calls, their visits, the small requests she leapt to fulfill. She built her world like a tight orbit around their gravity, believing that love meant being close, being available, being indispensable. But the closer she circled, the more they drifted, not out of malice, but because it's in our nature to turn away from what feels too close, too tethered. Eleanor sat in the silence of a missed phone call one afternoon, the emptiness of it pressing heavier than usual, and in that silence, a question rose. What else could I turn toward if I stopped only turning toward them? So she began to expand, not with resentment, but with quiet curiosity. She picked up a paintbrush, colors she hadn't touched since her 20s. She booked a trip to a small town she once loved but never returned to. She started walking each morning, not with a destination, but with a willingness to simply be under the sky again. And as her orbit grew, her laughter deeper, her days fuller, something shifted. Her children, sensing her glow, found themselves drawn back, not out of obligation, but out of a new kind of wonder. Science might speak of individuation and emotional autonomy, but the soul says it more simply. You were never meant to orbit their lives. You were meant to shine with your own gravity, steady, full, undeniable. And when you do, those who once drifted away find themselves wanting to come home to your light. There is a kind of respect that doesn't arrive when called and doesn't bend to demands. It drifts back quietly, like a bird returning to a tree because it trusts the branches to hold it again. You don't summon it with louder words. You don't chase it with restless hands. You become it. You become steady, whole, radiating the quiet certainty that you are already enough, with or without applause. Respect doesn't come because you ask louder. It comes because you remembered you never needed to ask at all. There is a soft kind of grief in loosening your hands from the need to be needed. It is not loud. It does not break things. It simply sits quietly beside you, like the setting sun that lingers longer than you expect. You may feel the ache where their approval used to live. You may hear the echo of the roles you used to fill, but in that emptied space, something else rises, not louder, not brighter, but truer. It is the steady pulse of dignity, a knowing that no longer waits for permission to exist. Dignity does not plead, it does not chase, it simply stands, quietly, completely, enough. And in time, others learn to meet you there, where you have always belonged. If one of these shifts stirred something inside you, whisper still worthy below. Because you are. You always were. You don't have to raise your voice to reclaim your place. You don't have to explain your worth to be worthy. You need only to stand, quietly, gently, without shrinking, without rushing. Stand in the full shape of who you are, not the parent who bent to every need, not the elder who softened their voice until it disappeared, but the soul who once taught them what strength looked like, without ever needing to say the word, the one who loved first, the one who endured long, the one who now chooses not to chase, but to remember. Respect does not return to noise. It returns to the place where love once stood unshaken, and still stands, waiting, glowing, whole. If something in this quiet walk found a place within you, there's no rush to move, no race to finish. Just breathe here a little longer. And if your heart feels ready, walk this slower path with us, where strength is measured not by noise, but by the steadiness of stillness. Subscribe softly if the journey feels like home. Share quietly if you know someone else searching for the place they have not yet forgotten. Because dignity isn't something we earn back by striving. It's something we uncover, already waiting, already glowing, quietly within.